So welcome everybody. I'm Barbara Komlish. I'm in the Center for Teaching and Learning, and welcome to Why Wouldn't I Just Use Google Scholar? And this session came about because, there we go, get rid of that on the screen. Because certain people come on in, like for us, brought up in our Introduction to SOTL course, well, I don't use library databases anymore to do research. I only use Google Scholar, and I was shocked personally. That's not how I was taught. And so quickly, I sent an email to Sajna Lacey, our wonderful librarian, and had a discussion with Matthew, and I'll let them introduce themselves, to please put on a session to educate us of when, where, and how are we supposed to be using Google Scholar. So here we are today, thanks to them, and I will turn it over to them. Thank you.
Go for it.
Hello. So my name is Matthew Viz Dunbar. I am the Data and Digital Scholarship Librarian here on the Okanagan campus. I was, prior to my current position, I was the Southern Medical Program Librarian. So a lot of my experience using things like Google Scholar and the other library resources that we have actually come in the context of large knowledge syntheses in the context of health. And then in my current role, I work with individuals in biology and then a lot of the quantitative sciences, so comp sci, math, physics, and those kinds of areas. And of course, I think part of what we're going to get out of this is that really it's about using the right tool depending on what it is that you need to do. And Google Scholar is really suited for particular tasks. And then we have other resources at the library that are well suited for other tasks. Sajni?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Sajni. I'm the Learning and Curriculum Support Librarian. So I kind of do more the arts and humanities sides of things, but I also kind of liaise with CTL. And so when Barbara told me this, a tiny piece of my soul left my body. And so I asked Matthew, who understands the back end of Google Scholar quite a bit more than I do. So it's really just kind of an overview to get the conversation started. So we're hoping that you all have questions and we can discuss.
And so with that, we have a slide deck, we have notes, but of course, this is, if people have questions, we're happy to take this wherever it happens to go. If we veer totally off the slides because that's where you want to go, that's totally fine with us. None of this really needs to be baked into the slide deck. So please ask questions as we go. I think what we'll start with is we'll just kind of start with a bit of an overview for as much as we know, how does Google Scholar work? And contrast that with some of the more traditional indexing databases that we have at the library, and kind of look at in what situations then might we favor one over the other. And then I think Sajni is going to then look at that in the context of the Scholar, in terms of SOTL. I've forgotten the O in SOTL.
of teaching and learning.
It's a small O.
It's a small O.
And then what some of the implications are in terms of doing research, but also in terms of what that looks like when we communicate this stuff with the students that we work with. But we'll dive on with why should I use Google Scholar. So we'll start this with why do we use Google and Google Scholar. I think Google in particular is designed really to find an answer. Which is actually the complete antithesis to what we're often trying to do in an academic environment, where we have a question. Yes, we're trying to answer it, but we're not trying to get Google to give us that answer. We're looking to find a diverse set of resources in order to base our inquiry upon. And I think if most people will have noticed the most recent update in Google, now when you ask a question, it's got a little highlighted section at the top. It really kind of has turned into this thing of like the encyclopedia or the dictionary. I think one of the interesting things about that too is that it really starts to conflate who is the authority behind that information, right? Is the authority Google, or is the authority the site that has produced that information that with Google's ranking algorithms is the first one that comes up? And I think this is often, if this is something which you are really used to using, you can conflate who the authorship of that information actually is when it appears within that Google page that you're looking at. We use Google Scholar in part because Google Scholar has so much data that it does such a fantastic job of bringing back what we want on that first landing page. And in some respects, this is, I would suggest it's inspired by the model of Google, which is about finding an answer, not about engaging in inquiry necessarily. And I think that so we'll leave it there in terms of looking at Google Scholar as an extension of that piece of Google really trying to like situate you where you are and having a significant amount of data to be able to work with to do that. And I think the thing with Google Scholar, like it is so great, is that single search bar, but if it's too good to be true, it probably is. And I think especially as a free resource, one of the things that we really try to encourage people to be critical of when they look at this is that one of the reasons a resource like this exists, and it exists for us to be able to use without monetary payment beyond what we pay to be able to access the internet, is that data piece, right? Google gathers a significant amount of data from its users in order to be able to leverage what it does and in order to be able to engage in various marketing activities based off of that. If anybody in the room has ever tried to use a service like DuckDuckGo, you will realize just how painful it can be to engage in that experience when that level of data collection isn't happening. But again, I want to contrast this with how we use this within the context of an academic environment. Are we looking for those quick and easy answers? And I think sometimes we are, or are we engaging in a process of inquiry, and then what do we need to be able to see and engage with in order for that to be able to happen? Okay, so what makes Google Scholar different from some of the other databases that we have at UBC, whether this be things like Web of Science, JSTOR, Scopus? So they're both, in essence, they're databases of the academic literature. But commercial indexing and abstracting databases really limit what they ingest. They limit based off of scope. So when we say scope, kind of like subject discipline, but also with regards to expert review. I think we all know in our academic conversations that expert review has its own flaws, but it does mean that the content that we're looking at has gone through some sort of protocol that we've agreed upon, whether that be the track record of a publisher, of an academic society, or of a specific journal. And I think also when we contrast this then when we have conversations with our students, especially at the undergraduate level, it's these proxies that we rely on. We're actually not asking our students to critically evaluate every single aspect of a research article to come up with their own evaluation. That is part of the learning process that they go through, but we rely on these proxy measures. And one of the things that the databases that we have to the library that are more traditional like this is that they actually cater to those proxies for us. This is much more challenging in something like Google Scholar, where ostensibly there is no scope beyond everything that is out there. And there is no real quality control in terms of having review bodies actually look at the material that gets ingested into Google Scholar. So I'm just looking at my notes to see if there's anything else that I wanted to touch on with regards to that. So at like a high level, what they're ingesting in is very different in terms of the review process for what comes in and the scope of what that material is. We'll expand on this a little bit to kind of talk about how these databases work. So for Google Scholar, it's blue, but it's meant to be a black box. We really don't know. If you look up documentation on how Google Scholar works, you're not really going to find anything. There was a time when you could get some developer documentation. If you try to find it now, there's virtually nothing. There's a help page for Google Scholar that talks in very high language about how it operates. We know that they work with publishers. We know that they crawl the web looking for academic content. We know that if you want them to crawl your site and pick up on your academic content, they provide instructions for what you should do in order to make it more accessible. So when we look at these, we can we can construe some things generally with understanding about how bots work as they crawl the internet, what a relationship with a publisher might actually look like, and we can try to make some guesses for what's happening on the back end. But we really don't know what this looks like, and in particular, we don't know what the library, we don't know what's actually in that database to be able to be fed back to us. I'm going to contrast this with something like PubMed. And then we'll talk about what kind of hits in between here. So for those who are not familiar with PubMed, PubMed is at least in the North American context, it's the preeminent scholarly database for health literature. It's funded at an arm's length by the US government. So it is a public resource, unlike some of the commercial entities that we will talk about. But in contrast to something like Google Scholar, PubMed has ranking algorithms. You want to know how it works? They published a paper on it. You can read the paper. You can read the technical documentation. You want to know what's indexed in it. They will provide you with a list of all the journals that they cover. You want to know how the search that you've put into that search bar has been translated. So this is another key thing, right? Whenever we put a search when we put a string of words into a search bar, there is a lot of stuff happening on the back end. You can imagine that they are looking at thesauri, they're looking at synonyms, they're trying to, most of these platforms are doing a bunch of like language guesswork on the back end to bring you back the most relevant content. If you want to know how that search has been translated, PubMed will tell you. They've got a paper on that. Google doesn't. If you need help with anything with PubMed, they've got a phone number and they've got an email address, and they usually get back to you within 48 hours. Google Scholar doesn't provide that for you. So when we look at like that contrast in terms of what this looks like as a service model, what it looks like as a bibliographic database model, they're very, very different. But they're also serving very different purposes. When we look at commercial offerings, so things again like what we get through EBSCO, what we get through ProQuest, what we get through the folks at Web of Science, these are they're maybe not quite as good as PubMed, but they definitely veer more in the direction of PubMed than they do Google Scholar. And one of the reasons for that is the kinds of questions that we have about how these systems work are things that we ask the vendors as libraries when we engage in these kinds of conversations. So we expect a certain level of documentation. We expect a certain level of knowing what is on the back end and how it's working, in part just so that we can actually compare these databases to each other and know whether or not we need to be spending money on more than one of them in order to provide the resources to our academic community.
Can I say something?
Yeah, of course.
Just to push back on this model of, it feels like there's an ivory towers here, right? Like these databases are basically feeding the publishers content, and the publishers are feeding it back into these databases, and basically keeping each other in business. And I find that extremely problematic.
It is.
Right? And so
100%.
So the reason Google Scholar is attractive is because you don't have to think about what's in it. Everything is in it.
But you still can't access the content.
You can link it through your library.
But you have to be part of that library to do, like, you still have to be part of the ivory tower to do it, not into the business. I'm not disputing on the main argument.
Yeah.
But there's still, we're kind of denying ourselves that
But
we're,
to access
these
databases, you also need access. You need to pay for this, right? These things cost money. So
Yeah.
I just.
But it's the same institution paying for those.
But they're
But they are, but not, like, as a member of the institution,
they're still paying on your behalf.
Yeah.
You are
either
paying
way,
twice.
Is my argument.
we are paying
And I think-
we're paying for PubMed, we're paying for Scopus, but
Yeah.
and instead
We pay for PubMed five times at the library
5 times.
on different platforms. We pay for it on different platforms
And
because
so,
they have different.
like, this Google Scholar thing has everything, and yes, it's true that you don't have fine control of what goes in there because you don't care. It's everything.
And I think one of the advantages of Google Scholar is that in many respects, it has the potential to limit publication bias because it actually brings more content in.
Right.
My throwback to
Mhm.
that, and it's a couple slides down, is
I'll
that,
wait.
we can wait. I mean, is that Google Scholar doesn't let you in more than 1,000 hits.
Right, but
And those 1,000 hits
Yeah.
are ranked on an algorithm
Mhm.
that includes things like your browsing history, your IP address.
Sure.
So when we think about the kinds of bias that go in,
Yeah.
there is a bias in Google
Or
Scholar,
recency
and that
bias,
bias is a
yeah.
different kind of bias than what you get in things like Web of Science and PubMed.
yes.
And I think that's where it's really about, like, why are we using it?
The one thing that I think the indices have going for them is that if you're doing a meta-analysis or a meta-review, you can really limit the scope of what you're trying to look for so that it's not millions of things. Because realistically, 1,000 hits is more than what I would ever look at. And if I wanted to go more than that, I would filter by year. So 1,000 in 2022, 1,000. So as I go down. So there's always ways around it, but I don't see the value still, right? And yeah, the PubMed has the things all listed, but it's from the top tier journals.
Yeah.
It doesn't have all the open access journals, for instance. It doesn't have all the most relevant, most pioneering stuff out there because it's stuck in some review cycle somewhere. So it doesn't have archive or bioarchive. And so, like, I don't want to be limited with what I search for.
Yeah, and I think I would suggest again, I think that's a bit of a balance, right? I think as an expert in a field who knows their content really well, one of the reasons that Google Scholar is so great is because you actually do take advantage of that ranking algorithm, and when you need something quickly, and you're able to do that evaluation on the fly of that material, Google Scholar is fantastic. I think when you're somebody who is in the process of learning the difference between what is a proxy measure of quality and what is an actual measure of quality, and you're really trying to figure out what is the scope of what is like what is available within a certain research discipline, then the criteria are very different. And then, like you said, the other kind of aspect of that is this notion of doing things like scoping reviews, systematic reviews, and meta-analyses. And so most of the people I work with when we do that, we're working with anywhere between 4,000 and 45,000 citations that we're dealing with. And in those situations, we leverage Google Scholar, but Google Scholar on its own. And we'll get to that as well, is that like using a single source often isn't the best approach, because every single source will be limited in terms of what it's able to bring back to you.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, look forward to seeing.
Okay, but that being said, I mean, basically everything that's in PubMed is in Google Scholar is the biggest. If it's in PubMed, it's in there. It's just a question of whether or not it actually gets to you through your search or through that first 1,000 hits.
Yeah, you need to know how to search.
Yeah.
Right?
But then getting to what you were bringing up in terms of like being able to refine your search results, one of the things that also differentiates the way that Google Scholar works versus a traditional indexing and abstracting database is really just how it's organizing that information. And so if you think about like back in the day, most of us, I'm going to assume, are maybe old enough to remember that at the end of a year, a journal would publish a volume that had an index and a subject heading section to it, so that when you wanted to know what was published that year, you didn't have a database to go to, but you went to all those back of the book indexes, right? When things like PubMed, Web of Science, all those kinds of things, when they went online, they basically just took those year-end volumes and digitized them. So what you get access to is you get access to really structured metadata that's often augmented by somebody adding subject headings to it beyond the keywords that an author does. And this is one of those things as well. It's a gripe of librarians in general. Academics usually do a really bad job of supplying author-supplied keywords. You're too involved in what you do. And so author-supplied keywords are actually usually not a great way of keyword indexing publications. Having somebody apply those subject headings is often really beneficial. And what we're able to do then is everything is kind of blocked out between what's a title, who's an author, what is their affiliation, what is the abstract. And so you can really kind of target your searches across this. Sorry, my screen is blank. I think we're good to go to the next slide. And then basically what you get back is a consequence of what's in those fields. When you look at Google Scholar, so this is interesting. This is the, they make it very clear that they're not indexing journals, they're indexing papers. This is one of the reasons why on your Google Scholar profile, you get things like an H index, but you don't get an impact factor because that's at the journal level. While they do work with publishers, because they go elsewhere, we also start to see that when you want your stuff discoverable, they've got certain rules and conventions that they want you to follow. So they want it to be a PDF. They've got some notions about where the title should sit, where the author should sit. And what this tells you is that when their bots are calling around, they're using these conventions to try to figure out what the structure of that document is, because they don't have access to the metadata. They do for the stuff that comes from the publishers. They don't from the stuff that just sits out there, which is one of the reasons why when you then think about the whole database that sits behind Google Scholar, they can't provide that level of granularity of access in a search. It's simply because they work with too much content that's too messy. I think in some respects as well, it's valuable to think of Google Scholar as it obviously it indexes content, but it also indexes searches. And this is like when we think about Google, Google is a search indexer. And so part of what they're keeping on the back end is a list of who has searched for the same thing that you searched for. What have they then subsequently clicked on? And does Google have tracking metrics to be able to figure out how long they stayed on that link? And that goes into these ranking algorithms, right? It also goes into that prompt that you get in that search is dynamically being populated from the server on the back end. So as you start to type, Google's like, oh, can I predict for them what it is that they're going to be asking, rather than allowing that person to ask the question that they want to ask? Which again, it has its pros and it has its cons, I think, depending on how familiar you are with the content and the subject area with which you're working. And then, of course, when we think about like that back of the book index in terms of the information that they're using things like your Google Scholar profile, your IP address. Never anticipate that a search that you run right now is going to return the same results in those top 1,000 hits as it is for somebody else, or as it will 3 months from now, even for yourself. These things are constantly fluctuating. Which then comes down to what does Google Scholar actually show me? So this is, I ran a search here. There were 137,000 results in the top. In the bottom one, you can see in the URL, I tried to go to the 1,000th hit, and you get an error. Google doesn't let you go beyond 1,000. In a traditional database, you get access to everything. So even though there is, say in PubMed, there's a ranking algorithm where they try to show you at the outset what they think are the top hits. You get access to everything if you want everything. When you go to Google Scholar, you don't get access to everything. You get access to that subset, and that subset is potentially, well, it's not potentially, it is biased. And it is calculated specifically to try to hit to you as an individual, depending on how much data they have on you, the institution that you're coming from, et cetera. This is one of those things where we often recommend, if you're going to be using something like Google Scholar in the context of actually doing something like a meta-analysis or a larger review, that you do things like go in from a station at the library, that you don't log yourself in. If possible, you use a VPN so it doesn't look like you're coming from an academic institution. There's a lot of things to try to anonymize yourself to make the response as generic as possible. Again, when you're about to deliver a talk and you need that latest paper, you actually don't want that, right? Then you probably want Google to know exactly who you are, because it's going to bring back the most relevant stuff at the top. Okay, and just kind of like looking back again, when we think about that 1,000 and what is that ranking algorithm, that's as much information as we get from Google. People have attempted to reverse engineer things like Google and Google Scholar to see if they can figure out what they're doing. I haven't seen anything, I don't think, in the last 5 or 6 years that's attempted to do this. I think things are just changing way too quickly, and things are probably getting far too complex for it to be worthwhile. But I don't have any evidence on that specifically. I just know that this kind of stuff has started to disappear. Whereas again, looking at that PubMed example, if you want to know what's in that top 1,000 hits, they'll tell you exactly how they got there. Okay, so this moves on. I think, yeah, we're going to pass it off to Sajni.
Yeah, so I will be honest, Matthew understands the back end of this a lot better than I do, because I'm an arts and humanities person. But what I do know a lot about is the questions I get from hundreds of first-year students in their required English classes who are doing this, because I see the majority probably in some context. And so with our increasing diversity of our student body, students want to read stuff in their home languages. And Google Scholar is really terrible about prioritizing anything other than English, even when you try and get the right stuff that's in those languages. And that's pretty well documented in the literature. Google Scholar, like to your point, this is true of all of the tools. Mm-hmm. And I don't think either Matthew or I are saying that any of this is good in the sense of like inclusion, transparency, any of that necessarily. But Google Scholar in particular is particularly brutal for that perpetuation of citation politics, where we continue to cite the same people over and over because we run that search. Students run their searches and they're not always super sophisticated at what they search. They see that top article has been cited 600 times and they're like, great. And it continues to be the same, middle-aged white dudes that then continue to be generated. And then that just increases the popularity and all of that jazz. Google Scholar is heavily based on citation counts, which Matthew said. So it really skews when and we know that students are typically like, I ask them every single time, how many of you go past the first page of results on Google? How many of you go past the top result page or first page of results in Summon, the general search on the library? And like, it's always the computer scientists who raise their hand. And there's like 2 of them per class, maybe, right? So we just know that and Google's really, really prioritizing showing you that best stuff on the first page. So we know that the students are also not getting a robust sense of the literature, and they don't have those skill sets yet to be critical of what they're seeing and evaluate all the criteria that we would want them to do. So from my own experience, topics like SOTL, as well as arts and humanities topics, because they're often in lower citation counts in general, are not super well represented in Google Scholar always. It's totally anecdotal, but when I have students in visual arts or English lit, what they're struggling to find what they need or what they think that they're going to find. And I struggle too, because they're just not getting the same amount of hits and citation impacts that sciences and social sciences are getting. So there's a challenge there. And like Matthew said, the benefit of Google Scholar is that you are in theory getting everything, but then the disciplinary nuance can be lost in that. And that's maybe not that important depending on the topic, but for some, it is really important, especially for students who are new to the field. It might be really important that they just look at stuff in engineering to start, or they might just look at stuff in psychology to start, and understand the conventions within that. I mentioned the quality of content after the first page. And then there's, as Matthew's already kind of talked about, and we'll talk about a little bit more, that kind of aspect of replicating your searches.
I don't know if this is the right time to ask this question. But, I remember when I first discovered Google Scholar, when it was first coming on board. This was like 2006, 2007, and it was just like amazing, right? And a lot of faculty, like this is when I was doing my master's, a lot of faculty were like, this is the best thing ever, we're not going to use anything else. And I did use it for many years. And then I found, I mean, more and more, especially the last 5 years, I've been basically summons only. Because when I go to Google Scholar, all I get is book reviews. All like it does, you know, it doesn't seem to matter what search I'm doing. It was just like inundated. I mean, maybe not all of it, but it would be inundated and just kind of like a waste of time. And I don't know, I didn't find it easy to filter those out the way that in Summons, I find the filtering so easy and straightforward. So I like that was what I really found. And also too, I really found that no matter what, Google just likes to think it's smarter than you, right? So it was no longer, like it didn't, I don't know, I could be wrong, but I felt like it no longer accepted basic Boolean terms and the use of quotation marks and things like that, like you couldn't, so I would get, so I'm trying to search a term like I have done and a lot of work in there of historical GIS and qualitative GIS, and it won't like keep these together as a phrase. And so it was like, trying to be smarter than me all the time. And I'm sure there's times that it is smarter than me, but like, it's like, but this is my subject and this is what I'm trying to find. And I couldn't tell it that. It took those controls away from me.
I mean, yeah, I have similar issues when it's like generic English words that you're trying to search for, like learning analytics, for example. It's just like
right, that have a meaning to you together, but Google thinks of So so listen, I don't know if this is the place to ask those questions, but
yeah, and I mean, I don't know, like I think it's kind of fascinating because kind of what Google Scholar pioneered, which now systems like Summon do, which they didn't used to do. You would like back in the day when you searched the library and you had that single search bar, it would actually run your query in like 6 different databases and then bring you back the results. Now there's a backend system that amalgamates all the results of those databases, so it searches in just one place. But that's modeled off of Google Scholar because that's kind of what Google Scholar did. Google Scholar didn't say we're going to search a whole bunch of different places for you. They said we're going to bring everything together as one search portal, and it worked phenomenally. It worked really, really well. But I think they've aspects of it. So you can do some of that more complex stuff in Google Scholar, but it's not easy, and the rules change. And the rules aren't documented. So like the searches that I constructed when I first started doing this, like 7 years ago with the health sciences, many of those searches won't run in Google Scholar anymore because they've changed how they interpret some of that stuff.
And I think that's a shift I really felt, where therefore I felt like I could no longer be confident in the results. So I just walked away from it basically.
The reproducibility is definitely concerning because I think that's a feature. Google will tell you that it's a feature because the algorithm is adapting to 5 years of people searching for these terms. And so the same things that ranked high is no longer. And so, I see that as an issue.
And I think so. This is just you don't need to read. You don't need to look at the references. This is just 4 examples I was able to pull out super quick within PubMed. There are tons of examples of people doing this kind of research who are basically looking at when we do these larger knowledge syntheses. And so when I talk about this, because the people I work with are usually in the sciences, I often talk about like when we're looking in the literature, we're looking for evidence, and that evidence is going to inform policy, it's going to inform best practice, it's going to inform the clinical practice guidelines that our doctors are giving us to tell us when we should be screened for particular kinds of cancer, right? And so when we do these, we need to be able to find as much evidence as we possibly can. And so a lot of people have looked at these knowledge syntheses which have taken place and looked to see whether or not a single database is ever sufficient. And what they've discovered is that you can get basically any systematic review that you can pull up. If you put one of their references into Google Scholar, 99.9% of the time it will be found. If you put that same reference into any of the other databases, whether that's PubMed, Web of Science, any of those, there's probably about an 80% chance that it will be found. But if you take their search strategy and you try to find all the papers that were returned by their original search strategy, the return that you get in Google Scholar is, because you only get the first 1,000 hits, you get a mere fraction of what you got the first time around. Whereas because the other databases are stable, you get the same results back that you would have, minus obviously what was not indexed in those. The key takeaway from all of these then is that you should always use a disciplinary database, and you should always use Google Scholar. Right? You have to use more than one. You have to use more than one. If you want to be able to find that comprehensive evidence base, you have to use both. No single one will be sufficient, and usually you have to use 3.
Will we talk more about summons? Is that on the agenda, or can I ask questions about summonses?
I'd say ask away.
So one of my, I teach in human geography, and of course geography is the original interdisciplinary discipline, right? So, yes, there are, various things that call themselves disciplinary databases we should use, but the reality is everything we do, we need interdisciplinary stuff. We need stuff from all, urban studies, or like pick whatever, topic you're looking for. There's going to be out of discipline stuff that we need as well. So broadly social sciences, and even beyond that at times. And so, like, is there any reason, I guess I should say, not to just be using summons? And I would say I would just add that to both at, we'll say, the undergraduate level, and then as well, say, for my own purposes.
I can speak from the undergraduate level. So the students that I work with, I'm like, yeah, summon will do everything you need it to do. And it starts to get, because it has such, I think, Beth, you can correct me if I'm wrong, pretty strong filtering. It allows them to think about what are they actually looking for, rather than just typing into a search bar. Because I talk about, like, why do you like Google? And they're like, it's fast, it's easy, it's convenient, it always brings me something. And I'm like, totally. How are you picking what you find? Well, I just look at what's at the top. And I'm like, okay, so your profs are going to ask you for something a little bit different, right? They're probably expecting it's peer reviewed. If you're in the sciences, they're probably asking from a specific date range. So when they go into Summon, I'm like, yeah, put in your search. You have to be a little bit more intentional about how you do that, a little, not a ton more. And then you don't even have to think beyond, okay, I put in my search, now let me see what I have on the left, because it already gives me options only based on the results that I have. So for undergraduates, I'd say like up until maybe 3rd, 4th year, and 4th year more so, I would say, depending on discipline. If they're doing like a thesis or a major project, or they're thinking about graduate school, then I start to encourage in the 3rd and 4th year that you use Summon as well as a database as well. And they get really kind of jazzed about it, because, they can click 5 things and get rid of a ton of crap. And then they're like, okay, well, now you know that you're looking at peer reviewed, library accessible, within the parameters set by my assignment. And they don't have to do a ton more work.
And there's that great preview, or that great button, view PDF now, and see
Yeah.
like the whole thing is just so efficient.
And depending on the citation style, the citation generator is better.
Oh yeah, I use that all the
Yeah.
time.
So I'll let
students know that
Yeah,
all the time.
yeah. Like APA, it does pretty well.
Yes.
MLA, it's a little bit.
I point out, especially as it is geography, they do get penalized for not capitalizing place names. That's a big one, and a lot of them struggle with learning the hanging indent that doesn't come through. But
Yeah.
that's the thing, is that I definitely am an efficiency person, and it's very efficient.
Absolutely.
Right?
I don't know if you want.
Yeah, so like I do a lot more work with graduate students. With graduate students, I always say that they should find their disciplinary database and use Google Scholar, but they should use both. They should find one database that is really, really targeted for them, and they should supplement it with Google Scholar. I also really encourage people to, if you have an area of research, to set up like a search alert. So you run a search, which runs all the time. I would only do those really in Google Scholar.
Though I would challenge you with one thing, which is that our entire graduate program is interdisciplinary. And therefore, so for example, even my own work, I know, like, there's no way I could have stuck to one, because, my topic was like historical and GIS, right? And so that's my only real challenge with that, is one thing. And I don't know, maybe just the fact that geography doesn't really have if you go into anything that kind of touts itself as, like, you would basically end up with a web of science.
Yeah.
It's sort of your only option, and then you're still filtering things out.
Yeah.
So
I mean, at this stage, now that we also have Scopus, I would probably actually send most people towards Scopus instead of Web of Science, unless they were specifically from certain disciplines.
Maybe the other thing I can add that I do encourage students at the undergraduate level is using Summon to find out what disciplines are talking about this topic. Because what is also really nice about Summon is then you can, sometimes if you look at the quick look, it'll tell you what database it came from. But or you can click through to the database and see. And so I'm like, then you can run a search, do your limits, look through a page or two find the articles that kind of resonate with you based off of title and abstract, and then see who's publishing in those areas and which disciplines. And then you can take that knowledge and apply it into an interdisciplinary context. But it gets them a little bit more familiar with thinking about, especially because when I'm working with undergraduate students, they're in all different fields except for engineering, because engineering has their own wheelhouse of stuff. And they're like, yeah, like, I want them to try, I want them to dabble, right? I feel like they don't come that curious anymore by the time they finish high school. And it allows them to be a little bit more exploratory, which I think is important as part of the process.
I guess maybe I'll just flip my question the other way then. What do those disciplinary databases have that Summons can't give me?
Depending on the database, they give you, so a lot of those databases, when they ingest that material, will ingest different fields that organize that information in different ways, and they'll have.
Oh, sorry. Siri heard me.
And they'll have different supplementary metadata that they add on to it. When you search somewhere like Summon, any of those unique pieces to those databases is not really available for someone to search, because Summon has to somehow harmonize the information from all those different databases with it being organized differently. So you will never, you are unlikely to ever get the same results set in Summon from a specific database as you would when you actually go into that database. That would be the big difference.
But the actual content, we'll say, is it's actually the same content. It's just because it's using so many different tools and information to get to it, you might get different results.
I would say exactly the same content, always with a caveat. Always with a caveat, and always with a time delay.
Okay.
With that time delay being anywhere between like a month and like 8 months, depending on how that information is being fed in from the publisher to Summon.
Okay, great. That's very helpful information. Thank you. I cut you off.
No, I was gonna cut you off. The metadata is the same though, right? That Google Scholar and Web of Science and Scopus are accessing. It's exactly the same metadata.
So it would be things like, so if we think about somewhere like PubMed and their use of medical subject headings, there's a very good chance that when you search Summon, that your terms are not being properly mapped and leveraging things like medical subject headings. I think like a really good example as well is that this is kind of intriguing. If there are people in the room who use Web of Science, if you search Web of Science core collection, and then you run that same search across all platforms that Web of Science has available to us, and then you filter to look at only the results in core collection, you will always have more results because it's leveraging metadata that's in the other databases that Web of Science has. So in that case, Web of Science, because it's a Clarivet product and they have access to all that, they're using that. When you're somewhere like Summon or Google Scholar, I really don't know what kind of power they have to leverage all of that additional data. Even thinking that like PubMed isn't just leveraging like medical subject headings, they're running your search query through about 3 or 4 other thesauri before they even map that into medical subject headings before it gets back to you. I wouldn't anticipate that something like Summon is hitting things to that level.
Okay. We have a question from Anita.
Yes, hi. This is all wonderful and great. Thank you. I just finished marking a big research paper, and Sajni is so kind. She always comes to my English 112 and gives reasons as to why I really focus on using the library, UBC library catalogs and databases. So I thought if I were to ask, so I asked my students this year because the research paper pertained to talking about Indigenous peoples and lack of access to healthcare. So my question is that I was hoping that they would use different database, EBSCO and so on, for them to because I asked them to look for at least one scholar that comes from Indigenous person's perspective. They all use Google Scholar, and as Sajni was saying, I am familiar with all the names of the same scholars who were cited over and over. So 65 research papers. Unfortunately, I think it's because they were probably able under the Google search engine type in Indigenous person wrote this or did that. So there was maybe more freedom for them to type in and then get more research. Sajni kindly has pulled out a few websites that they could go specifically and ask, and I can't remember the names now, but ask or visit where they get the perspective from written by First Nation who is also a scholar, and we want to encourage them and bring them into the discussion table with us. But I think there were a few different sites they had to go visit. So I think that's probably the reason why I'm hoping that over time we'll be able to encourage students even more to use university and other avenues, right, to access the information.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole other level of complexity, and I'm getting this question a lot, that students want, or they've been required to use an quote unquote Indigenous scholar, or somebody from, the 2S LGBTQIA plus community, that they, and I really talk about that. I try really hard to talk about that in classes. I'm not always as successful in the first year. That one of the issues with just using Summon or just using Google Scholar or just picking from some set facets of limiting options is that you're losing the nuance of perspective. And that when they only need 3 or 5 sources, especially in the first year, they should be Googling who those authors are and seeing how they self-identify, especially if they're talking about a topic connected to one of those communities. Now, there's a whole other layer of people claiming identity that they don't have a right to. And this is the thing, it's so nuanced that just plugging stuff into Summon or Google Scholar is just not enough or acceptable, depending on what the topic is, but I would say universally. And so I do try and talk to students too about some of the issues and flaws with the peer review process in terms of whose perspectives are continuing to be replicated and all of these things. And that takes nuance. And, I'm getting a little riled up about it, but because I think, students, I see so many assignments that are, write 1,500 words on a topic of your choice with 5 peer-reviewed articles in APA. That's the assignment. And that's not enough. There's like a 50,000 micro tasks in there that we're asking them, and they don't yet have the skill set to do it in the way that they're expected to produce. They have pretty good crap detectors, I think, most of the time when we talk about what makes information good, what makes somebody an authority. I try and have all these conversations. But it's also really hard to do when I have 50 minutes with them in their first year, in the first 6 weeks that they're at university too. I mean, I know you all are having these too, but it's complex. So thanks, Anita. I try.
But I think
you did a great job.
Thank you.
And it was my first year doing it, so I think I'm also learning as I go along. Just how do what my expectations are from my students. Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
I think the other kind of piece, drawing off of that and connecting to your question about is someone good enough? I think there's also, because again, there's the context of the research that we might be doing, and then when we're a figure of authority, say in a classroom, or the students move on to be practitioners in certain fields. This is one of those ones where if I went to my GP and they were looking something up and they use Google Scholar, I'd be significantly less impressed with that GP than if they went into PubMed. I would expect them to go to the authoritative source, even though I anticipate that later on, if they're going to look into it more in depth when I'm not there, I would expect them to use multiples. But I would expect them to be able to demonstrate that they know what the key resource is in that discipline to be able to use. If it's in marine biology, I'd expect them to pull up the aquatic science databases. I'd expect them to know where to go to figure out where the top tier research is supposed to be in order to address that question, that the reason that they're looking at is because maybe they don't know what the answer is, as opposed to just a reminder or a follow-up if their areas are diverse. So if we're in front of a classroom, I think that there is something a little bit deleterious to just pulling something up and doing it in Google Scholar, because of what that communicates as the go-to behavior at that stage in somebody's academic career.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Do you have more slides or more questions? Let's see.
We have a couple more that I think are mine, so I can whip through them really quick here. So I don't think I need to say much more than what we've already talked about, but you should be using more than one is the short end of the story, for all the reasons that we've already talked about. I kind of already touched on this a bit about talking with students about Google Scholar. So it has not dissimilar pros and cons just using Google, and they know some of that. I also think we haven't really touched on the data mining implications of this, but those are enormous in my mind. The fact that we're like, yeah, no problem, just scrape all that data from me is a totally reasonable thing to do. I don't think is an acceptable stance for us just to kind of, without acknowledging that that is part of what we're contributing to. So Google Scholar is one of many tools to use. And I do say, especially with graduates, the few graduate students that I work with, when they're like, who do I know who's seminal in my field? I'm like, probably your supervisor should be helping you with that. But that cited by feature is helpful for getting a quick sense of the landscape for that. And it does do that really well. So that citation tracking can be really useful. Disciplinary nuance is lost. Often students don't know that you can connect it through the library, whether you add that to your settings in Google Scholar or in Google, or you go through the library because we have it listed as a database so they can go through it, that portal too. And then the last two are the most important for me, is about evaluating the quality. So, and modeling good behavior, or maybe not good behavior, it's a bit of a judgment category there, but modeling behavior of what robust, thoughtful research and source querying should look like for students is really important. I in no way think that the way we have it set up right now in academics and how libraries have to, I wouldn't say we want to buy information this way and double dip, as you've so alluded to, having to buy it through multiple sources, that we're buying these database packages that have huge monopolies on information. I'm not jazzed about that either. However, it is something that I also think we need to work with our students, that they're the next generation to help disrupt that too. And so thinking about the information landscape as nuance and a constellation of options, and that never in our lives should we be going to just one place to find information, because that's not what they do either. They talk to their mom, they check it out on TikTok, they then Google it, they do all of these things. And we can translate and help them move those skill sets into a slightly different context. And that's basically it.
Great, thank you. Any questions?
Just picking up on something you just said, because I had forgotten about the Google Scholar, the complicated instructions. I guess they're not complicated, but they seem complicated to me, for like accessing Google Scholar and linking
to the library.
Mm-hmm. And I remember like several years ago, like finding this off-putting, and then finding that I didn't need to do that. Like the whole Gmail, like signing up with a Gmail account and all that stuff. I don't know, like maybe I'm mistaken, but if I just like search things and then you click access through your library and then
so that's and I don't know, Matthew can also correct me if I'm totally off base with this, but not like a good chunk of the time students are like, oh, it's already doing that. And I'm like, because it's mining your data.
Yeah. Which, I mean, we were filling ourselves and we haven't all signed on for that already.
Exactly, right? So they're just like, oh, well, it just works. And I'm like, but why? Like, there's no question, there's so little questioning about it. And I think that's the problem, because it's like, when I have to go teach in an upper year English class about posthumanism and critical animal studies, do I go freaking read the Wikipedia page? Of course I do, because I don't know about that topic. How am I going to show them how to search? But what am I going to show them is a couple of options so that they can think about them and make their own choices. And I think Google sometimes takes away those choices, and we don't talk about that. Sorry, I get so riled up.
So, I mean, I actually teach privacy ethics and data science. So this is like, I am anti-Google 100% of the time. But it just feels like there's two evils, right? There's the evil of the data collection, the data harvesting and the algorithms, but there's also the evil of the entire publishing industry itself. And
Totally.
you just have to choose which is the lesser of the two evils for the task that you're trying to do. And there are other things out there, like I've been hearing things about the semantic scholar thing that's out there. It's also AI driven, but it's a lot more like transparent and open. But essentially the idea is that it democratizes the searching of academic scholarly literature. And I think that's what I really want to figure out how to do with those other disciplinary databases as well.
Totally.
If you could somehow separate those from the journals, I would use them.
Yeah.
But it just, you you said a little part of you dies when people use Google Scholar. A little part of me dies because you have to pay these publishers so much money to publish, and then they're
Totally.
also the ones feeding the information into their own systems and charging libraries, so
Yeah.
we're getting like triple charged.
Although it's so funny because something like Semantic Scholar wouldn't exist unless Crossref existed, because that's
Right.
where they pull their data from, and
That's
Crossref wouldn't exist if there weren't the need for DOIs,
Right.
which is being paid for by publishers, which we're then paying. Like
Yeah,
it's a huge mess.
Somewhere along the line, you just pull one thing. And it's okay, well, this is great. Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Any other questions from those of you online?
Probably wait. That doesn't even get you into the preprint servers and things like archive and stuff like that, right? And how we get access to that wealth of information that is part of that, what's missed through publication bias. Yeah.
And it doesn't get into the fact that as a new scholar, the expectation is that you will publish in certain types of places, and you can't make that choice in order to be successful, to go with open access or other forms of
Yeah.
dissemination.
It has to have an index.
So it's like, it's all a thing that everything feeds into each other. And so,
Or you don't have the money to pay for the open access.
Yeah.
yes, or that too. Yeah. Oh, capitalism.
Oh, we're ending on such an upbeat note. Thank you.
It's all broken.
No, it is something in the sense that I think we're all acknowledging that it's complex, right?
Right,
And
right,
that,
right.
you know.
There's not a neat, simple answer.
No.
Which is great. But we've had a lot of answers today.
Yeah.
So
this has
thank
been
you,
really-
Matthew and Sajni, and thank you for
Yeah, very
those,
helpful.
everybody who joined us, and hope to see you at another workshop.